Good morning, bonjour, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you stay. Bonjour à tous, bienvenue dans ce webinaire. Bon après-midi.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar and welcome depending on your time zone.
To this webinar organized by the International Labour Organization and the ITC-ILO on behaviors inside an immersive experience to promote fair recruitment. My name is Myriam Boudra. I'm responsible at the International Training Center of the Labour Migration Cluster. And I will be today, I have the pleasure today to facilitate this webinar. And we are very happy to have with us some of our colleagues. Let me maybe first introduce Claire Hobden, who is the coordinator of the ILO Global Strategy to Make Decent Work a Reality for Domestic Workers, and also a behavior scientist working to develop behaviorally informed approach to decent work. Then we also have another colleague, Gaëla Roudy-Fraser, who work at the ILO as Chief Technical Advisor of a global project called Integrated Programs on Fair Recruitment. The project implements the ILO Fair Recruitment Initiative in selected countries, and the innovative approaches that we are discussing today were developed within this project in collaboration with experts of different ILO department and partners organization. But before going to the heart, I would say, of this meeting, let me just give you some information, and particularly allow me to speak in French for our francophone participants. Aujourd'hui, la plupart de la principale partie de la réunion
Today, most meeting will be held in English, but we have also thought about the interpretation. So at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a sphere, a globe with the interpretation. You will just have to select your language of choice, English or French, and you will be able to express your questions in your language. So you will just write down your questions Q&A, and we will try as much as possible during this webinar so that you can ask your questions to our experts. So this is about the practical information, and then I will now switch back to English.
As I just say, we have the pleasure to have the two colleagues with us today, Claire and Gaëla. Thank you very much for joining and also for organizing and this event together with ITC-ILO. Gaëla, I will give you the floor immediately to provide a welcome note and introduce the Hong Kong pilot, and as well to introduce a bit the videos that we will see in a couple of minutes. Back to you, Gaëla.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miriam. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. So the pilot we are presenting is part of the ILO's work to promote fair recruitment practices in Hong Kong, with a focus on protecting and ensuring access to decent work for migrant domestic workers. So before, just a couple of words on that context. So migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong make up about 10% of the workforce. So this was over 380,000 as per data from 2018. And according to a report by the organization Enrich, they contribute to about 3.5% of overall GDP in Hong Kong. So up to 15% of Hong Kong's households have a live-in domestic worker. So domestic workers, they are legally required by their respective consulates to use a private employment agency when initially taking up employment. And these agencies are permitted by the law to charge up to 10% of the worker's first month of salary. So this is about, in US dollars, about $56. And research by ILO partners, the Progressive Labor Union of Domestic Workers in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Federation of Asian Domestic Workers Union found that over half, actually 50% of foreign domestic workers who were interviewed were excessively charged illegal fees by agencies, on average more than 20 times the maximum chargeable agency fee. And about a third of these research respondents said they were charged even prior to receiving their first month of salary. So these practices are against the code of practice that has been put in place by the Hong Kong Department of Labor to regulate the sector. And now the problem with the excessive fees is that they contribute to creating a situation of debt bondage for the worker. And in combination with other abuses, such as illegal wage deduction, for example, this can amount to human trafficking and forced labor. So this is the context in which we have been working and trying to find a solution. So achieving fair recruitment in this context requires the creation of a marketplace that's going to promote agencies to adopt the fair recruitment practices. So traditional approaches involving closer regulation have significant limitations in the field of domestic work and recruitment agencies. This is because the worker is really in a single household and it's very difficult to monitor. So the ILO then turned to more innovative methods, including behavioral science and gaming and immersive learning experiences. In an effort to influence the clients of employment agencies who are the employers of domestic workers. And the idea is that then these employers do their own due diligence when selecting an agency and are more aware of the consequences of their choices. So our panelists today will present two key elements of this strategy. The first is a randomized controlled trial that was implemented to understand what type of communication can trigger behavior change amongst employers. And the second is the innovative campaign that was then developed to reach out to employers. So before we move on to the pilot, the idea is that we would like to propose to step back and start by taking a broader look at what's happening across the UN. To accelerate progress towards the SDGs with innovation. Because at the heart of the approach that we have been piloting is really the intention to protect the well-being and the rights at work of migrant workers who are low-skilled, mostly female workers. And as such, these objectives, they touch on several of the strings of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So our first speaker will join us on video message. Because she is in fact in New York, and it was very early in this case. So her name is Mrs. Ayaka Suzuki. She has been serving as the director of the Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit of the Executive Office of the Secretary General since April 2017, following 2 decades of service with the UN. And in her current capacity, she supports the Secretary General's decision-making mechanisms that helps drive the UN 2.0 Quintet of Change. This is the transformation agenda for the UN, which includes innovation and behavioral science. So Ayaka in this video will share with us insights on initiatives that are driven at the highest level of the UN to harness different types of innovations to meet the SDGs. So over to you, Miriam, for the video.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gaëla. And indeed, in this video, we will see you interviewing Ms. Suzuki. So I'm now asking Marion to screen the video, and thank you very much, Marion.
Good morning, Ayaka. We're very happy to have you with us. So to begin, the UN Secretary General has launched our common agenda and refers to the Quintet of Change as key tools in its implementation. Can you please tell us about these initiatives and particularly the role of the Quintet in carrying out this agenda?
Great. Well, thank you so much for the question. I think we all agree that the world we live in has changed radically over the past couple of years. The capabilities of the people in our organization, our most important asset, must evolve. That's really where the starting point of this Quintet of Change that the question is asking about. Adapting our organization to needs of today and make us ready for the increasingly complex challenges we face in the future is so important. So in our common agenda, the Secretary General is proposing to build next generation skills in areas like data, innovation, digital strategic foresight, and behavioral science. And in line with the recommendations in this report, we are really trying to help create an organization that is a 21st century organization, which is increasingly nimble, dynamic, and effective. And behavioral science is one of these newer and perhaps less known tools of such a UN 2.0, as we are calling it. But I'm very glad to see that it is explored widely across the UN system, and then ILO in particular has been a very leading force in this endeavor.
Thank you so much. And as a source of inspiration, would you have examples of other UN applications of innovation in accelerating progress towards the SDGs? Here may be examples of gaming, virtual reality, or other forms of innovation outside of behavioral sciences. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's great and gratifying to see that there's diverse, creative, and innovative programs that are being launched across the UN system, and a lot of it is facilitated by regular briefings and sharing of best practices by the UN Innovation Network. And these innovations include successes in areas like gender, education, health, prevention of violence, crime, labor, and environment. So yeah, you mentioned VR. UN Women have been exploring the potential of VR in reducing violence through tackling gender identity and social norms in Moldova. UNFPA has been trailing gamification to encourage family savings for maternal health costs and improve maternal health outcomes in Uganda. The World Bank has been using experimental evaluation of games, apps, and digital books aimed at improving self-efficacy and literacy outcomes among vulnerable populations in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. I think at ILO, we're very keen to learn from you, which you recently published research using behavioral science around recruitment practices for domestic workers to help avoid predatory intermediaries in Hong Kong. Global Pulse, which is Secretary General's Innovation Hub, built predictive model informed by data on geography, demographics, physical infrastructure that allows policymakers to distill insights by comparing the results of different potential scenarios in Bangladesh. Global Pulse also teamed with UNHCR and used machine learning to forecast a number of displaced people who entered Brazil from Venezuela and their need for humanitarian aid by analyzing public social media posts and radio broadcasts. The Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs here at the UN headquarters, they have used also VR to brief Security Council members on the latest situation in the UN mission in Colombia. So these are just some of many, many examples that we have today. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much. So Ayaka, your office has recently initiated efforts to build the capacity of UN entities to apply behavioral science. So can you tell us what has been done in that regard, and with references to the recent guidance note and so forth? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for the question. So in 2021, we developed and published a Secretary General guidance note on behavioral science to introduce this emerging tool to the UN system. And I hope you've had a chance to look at it. The guidance note described how BSI works, where it could support the delivery of our mandates, and some useful examples of how others across the multilateral space are using it. Just this year, we built on the system's experience, including those over 1,000 people who have joined the UN Behavioral Science Group, which is part of the UN Innovation Group, to develop a practitioner's guide. This guide provides specific recommendations on how to use BSI to improve the provision of programs and effective approaches on how to use it to reduce administrative burdens. And the guide also touches on ethical considerations that are critical when working to encourage behaviors. We have just come through the annual Behavioral Science Week, which took place last week. where we hosted over 20 events on the effectiveness of this tool, including from Nobel laureates and UN system leaders. And all of these materials are available on the UN BSci webpage, where you can also join the group and also sign up to the UN Innovation Network, where the BSci and a host of other new tools are being applied. And as I said, this community of practice is so important for these new innovative initiatives, because the more we learn about each other's experiences, the more we can continue to innovate and to do new things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaëla, for having this short interview with Ms. Suzuki before the webinar. I just want to recall to all participants that if you have any questions for experts, even if you have questions maybe on the videos, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we will have during the sessions related to Q&A the possibility to raise your questions to the expert. Just want also to say we hope that normally Ms. Mary McLennan should join the webinars and maybe answer to some of the questions related to Akaya's presentation. It's not yet confirmed, so we hope she can join. But otherwise, we also have Gaëla with us, who can provide, if not information on what some other UN agencies are doing, but at least of what has been done on fair recruitment regarding behavior insights. Without further ado, I would like to take the floor again and say that we have today with us Mr. Robert Godden, and who is the founder and executive director of Right Exposure, and he will be with us today, and particularly presenting the great tool that has been developed together with the ILO, and of course join the discussion. So Mr. Robert Godden is the founder and executive director of Right Exposure, a consultancy focusing on providing communication solutions for nonprofits. And before founding Right Exposure, he worked in the Asia Pacific program at Amnesty International, based in Hong Kong, also in Kathmandu and London. And within Right Exposure, he has worked with the Federation of Asian Domestic Workers Union, and as well the International Domestic Workers Federation and the ILO on several projects focused on the protection and promotion of domestic workers' rights in Hong Kong, including research, advocacy, and communication. We should have had today, and thank you very much, Robert, to be with us today and to joining us during this webinar, if I'm not mistaken, from Hong Kong. We should have today also with us Mr. Mario Herberts, but unfortunately he is not able to join because he is sick, and we wish him prompt recovery. But our colleague Claire is stepping in and to do the part he was supposed to present. But let me just still present a bit the background from Mr. Herberts. So he's a behavior scientific at the Consumer Decision and Sustainable Behavior Lab at the University of Geneva. And his research on sustainable consumer behavior, he investigated the psychological barriers to well-informed decision-making and how to address this barrier with targeted intervention. His work has been published in the most important scientific outlets on the behavior science, including Nature Energy and Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Claire, thank you very much to take the floor and to put, I would say, Mario's hat today for this webinar. So you will present the work he has been done for the ILO, and without further ado, I will give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It is unfortunate that Mario is not able to join us, as his research was extremely useful. It was fundamental to this project, but I will do my best to capture what he's managed to accomplish. Okay. So the challenge that we had before us was well explained by Gaela in the introduction. We wanted to see how we could change the market of employment agencies recruiting domestic workers in Hong Kong. Our idea is that employers of domestic workers are essentially the clients of these employment agencies, and therefore they have a specific decision or choice to make when they're selecting these employment agencies, and therefore that we can potentially influence the employment agency's behavior if they know that employers are selecting agencies with a particular set of criteria. As was noted, it's quite difficult to regulate or to influence this market in Hong Kong for various reasons. One of the big issues is that we don't really know how employers are making their choices, and we don't know how much effort they're willing to make to, we don't know how much effort they're willing to make to really do their due diligence. So our theory was that if we can get them to do more research on the employment agencies that they're selecting, they'll be more aware of the behaviors and the types of practices and the types of agencies that are out there and know which ones to choose. So again, it's a private behavior that's difficult to monitor. We know that for the most part, employers are unaware or unattentive to the potential repercussions of their choice, even though the impact on domestic workers is quite significant. Most employers do not seem to really be aware of the high fees that are being charged to domestic workers. And the theory is that if some of these employers are unaware or inattentive, that if we get them to do more search for information, that we can reduce some of the biases and the mistakes that they might be making in selecting illegally practicing agencies. So we conducted this research over 2 steps. The first one was structured telephone interviews. So we conducted, in collaboration with partners in Hong Kong, 20 interviews with either current or prospective employers of domestic workers in Hong Kong. And the idea was to really generate some hypotheses about how we might encourage employers to seek out more information on the agencies that they're considering. The second stage was that we used those hypotheses to design a randomized controlled trial, which we conducted online with a sample of around 2,000 Hong Kong citizens. And what we wanted to do was to test message frames using behavioral insights and the results from the qualitative research that we conducted in stage 1. And what we came up with was a set of 6 messages, which I'll get to in one moment, that we compared against one neutral message. Now, when they entered the randomized controlled trial, the online experiment, the first screen that they were showed was just basic neutral information about what some of the practices are among employment agencies. This was developed again with Rob and his team, and was a really great tool to bring employers into the experiment in a way that made them feel as neutral as possible. We did not want them to feel that they were being already tested, basically. So this part was just supposed to be a neutral set of information points that they could use to help them select an agency. They were then exposed to what we call the treatment. So this was a message frame, and we were asking them very simply to click on a link towards a website. It's a government website, in fact, run by the Hong Kong Labor Department, that shows information about employment agencies, and particularly those that have been already reprimanded for illegal practices. So the neutral message frame was, if you would like to consult additional information that can help you or your friends and family when recruiting a foreign domestic worker, please select below to be automatically redirected after the survey. And then there was the link to the website. And what we did was we measured the number of people who were willing to click on the link. So this was the neutral message frame. And then we compared it to 6 other message frames. So the first one was around cheating. We thought that perhaps we could get employers to want to seek out more information by making them think about the fact that they want to avoid employment agencies that cheat. So here the frame was additional information that can help you or your friends and family to avoid employment agencies that cheat. The second message frame was around professionalism. We had a theory from the beginning that employers would be interested in seeking out more professional agencies. So here we told them that if they clicked the link, it would help them find and select a professional employment agency. The third was on this notion of common protection. So it's again based on behavioral insights that the employers might want to protect themselves and also their domestic worker when choosing an employment agency, knowing that some of them have illegal practices. There were 3 more that we tested. 2 of them were based around social norms. Social norms are the notion that our behavior is heavily influenced by what we perceive to be the typical behavior among our peers. So if I believe that most of my peers are seeking more information through this government website, then I will be more likely to do that as well. So the first was a descriptive social norm frame. So here we just say that most Hong Kong citizens have found this link useful when recruiting a foreign domestic worker. And the dynamic one, the dynamic social norm frame shows that people are increasingly checking this website, or they increasingly care about making well-informed decisions. The final one was a government frame, and this was to test to see if people would be more likely to consult a source of information if it came from an official government website. Now, we tested all of these and we found some very interesting results, which is not always the case. Sometimes these experiments yield no results or negative results. So we were very happy to see that actually some of our hypotheses were true. And particularly, you'll see that the descriptive norm frame and the dynamic norm frame were some of the most effective in comparison to the neutral group. So this means that the social norm element was very effective in Hong Kong to encourage employers to seek more information and do their due diligence when selecting an employment agency. Professionalism, on the other hand, as you'll see, did not generate any statistically significant results, contrary to the hypothesis that we had first generated, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have an influence. It just means that in this experiment, we were not able to prove that it does. So overall, what this generated was that we know that carefully framed messaging can increase potential employers' consultation of information related to the recruitment of a domestic worker. The successful message frames tested here feed into the design of information material and information campaigns, which we will see very shortly in the next presentation. And since this research is among the first of its kind, the crucial elements included in the message frames should also be more closely investigated. This was, as I said, just a first effort, or one of the first efforts, I should say, and more research could be done to better understand also not just what employers would do in an online experiment, but also in a real life context, which we tried to approximate as much as possible. But again, it's not quite the same as what happens when employers have to make a selection in real life. So finally, the extended information search can improve employers' decision-making, but its effectiveness really depends on the quality and the reception of the additional information provided. So that would also be a potential second stage of research, is to better understand what employers do once they've consulted the government website, and how that might actually help them select an agency. So I'll leave it at that and pass the floor back to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Claire. Already some questions for you in the Q&A, and also I have to say some questions as well for you. Rob answered already to a question that was made regarding the materials of the language, if it was just in English or also in Chinese, and indeed Rob answered, yet it was all the materials was both in English and in Chinese. So let me just repeat it for the audience if they didn't have a chance to read it in the chat. I have more for your questions for you later on, Claire. And I think now, and you already mentioned it, I think with the result of the research came a very interesting and innovative tool. Have to say personally, when I saw it, I really enjoyed it, and this is something I really found very innovative and very useful as well. So I think we are very much delighted and excited to present it to the audience today. So let me maybe ask Marion if you can maybe share again your screen and the video to be presented.
My father passed away almost 3 years ago, and my mother got slightly stroke around the same time. Even though we managed to find the daycare center, but she only goes to there 4 days a week. So we need someone to help us to take care of my mother.
其實我請姐姐係因為我有2個小朋友開始，我先至唔係有第1個小朋友開始，我先至要請姐姐啦，係啦。咁如果我冇咗姐姐即係如果我冇姐姐幫手嘅話咧，其實我就一定係冇辦法出嚟返工，係啦，就要留喺屋企。咁就會我個成個生活真係會即係唔同晒咁樣咯。咁
I think we started to realize that we need a helper to take care of my 2 children, roughly around 2 months beforehand. Yeah, I think when we are becoming more desperate to get a helper, we try to just go to any of the agencies that we could find.
I started employed a Filipino maid 36 years ago. When my wife had my first baby, and we needed somebody to look after herself and also all the domestic work. We still need a domestic helper to take care of all the family cleaning, washing, cooking, etc. So leave my wife more time to rest, and she's still working anyway.
I think domestic helpers take a lot of stress off of parents, and because I have a domestic helper, I'm able to work full-time. It allows me, when I come home from work, to just focus on my family and focus on my kids. I don't need to then do the laundry, the dog walk, the dinner, the grocery shopping, because I've been privileged to have somebody else who is stepping alongside me to do that.
At the next intersection, turn left. 通常都會上網揾啦，朋友介紹啊咁樣咯。朋友介紹最多，即係如果朋友話好，佢用過話好咧，個信心就會大嘅，係啦咁樣。咁所以但係其實我又冇乜試過係朋友介紹俾我嗰啲嘅僱傭公司我揾到嘅。咁好多都係我自己上網揾，咁上網揾跟住睇佢冇一啲唔好嘅記錄咧，我就會嘗試搏一搏㗎啦。
When you walk in the agency and ask them that, okay, I need a domestic helper, try to state about your requirements. Most agencies, they will only take that, okay, any elderly people in your family, how many? Any children in your family, how many?
We went to an employee agency, the one we have been using for a number of years. They show us the video and we watch for several minutes and then make a decision. You know, very frankly, by the time we watch the video, we cannot tell whether this helper is a good one or not until the day she comes.
Your destination is 3 kilometers away. At the next intersection, turn right.
One question that we usually ask is about what does the fees include? Do they charge the helpers any fees associated with the employment? That's really important because I understand This is when trafficking can happen.
I think a lot of us don't realize what's happening behind the scenes with an agency. I didn't know myself until someone explained it to me, and had they not, I would have thought all agencies were sort of similar in their approach.
第一樣嘢就係佢會好站在兩方面，佢都會去關注我哋嘅需要咯。又或者係佢會好了解，譬如我去同嗰啲即係僱傭公司去傾嘅時候，我講我屋企嘅情況，佢會好知道啊，你咁嘅情況咧，可能揾個咩人咧就會比較適合嘅。
Most of agency staff, they did not even really clearly understand about the relevant ordinances. And I need to look up the immigration department's website one by one and try to argue with them. And I think the agencies, they need to improve the knowledge and competencies of their staff.
I think it would be great if the agencies themselves would be able to educate people more so that people know that there's a difference in agencies. Because if people know that there's a difference, I would imagine they would want to choose the one that was more fair and helpful to people, not putting people in debt.
Thank you very much for Marion for sharing the video. I think I just want again to emphasize that the video itself and the call for action featuring at the end of the video has been informed by the RTC findings that Claire presented before. Rob, I give you now the floor. So many interesting messages, coming from the employers you interviewed, and we see that. Well, many of them saying, well, we don't know what is happening behind the scene. We are lost as employers as well. So it's very interesting to see also how there is indeed also the need to educate employers, and they also themselves would like to know more and to know how it is happening, the whole recruitment process. We hear from these employers that themselves, they feel lost and they don't know what. And I think I really like these employers saying, we don't know what is happening behind the scene. And so that I found that very interesting. And I will maybe let you now, because the video explained about the tool you created, but maybe we can try to have a kind of side scene and see how the tool is working before going to the discussion with you, Claire and Gaëla. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miriam. I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to present here, and it's great to connect with so many people on this project. I'd like to say that there was a big team working on this, and thank you to all of them for their hard work in pulling this together. Just a little bit before I'd like to demo this site to you, but just before I do that, I'd like to talk through a bit of background on how we came to produce this specific tool. So the centerpiece of the Hiring Challenge project, and there are several elements to it, is this immersive online gaming experience, which uses branching storylines to affect behavioral change amongst our target audience, which, as you know, is the employers of migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. And so the objective is to engage that target audience and as an ally in cultivating ethical recruitment for domestic workers, or of domestic workers. And this really started back in December 2019 at a design thinking workshop that was held with a diverse group of stakeholders, including business and civil society. And the outcome was a decision to build a project that engaged employers and to use some sort of gaming sort of content. And the approach was chosen for several reasons, but mainly due to the evidence that its effectiveness in changing sort of attitudes and hopefully behaviors. And we settled on the experience being from the point of view of the employer, we had several options there. But we wanted to, we decided on that in order to reflect that sort of lived experience of the users, the audience, sort of emphasizing the sort of practical challenges they face. So rather than, for example, we could have chosen the point of view of the workers and with the objective of triggering and building empathy with employers. But we decided that it was better to have that sort of point of view of the employers so they could connect with it and then move through to the strategies that we want them to adopt. So as Claire was saying, you know, we had this random control trial and the results were incorporated into the website and other materials. So for example, the promotional video, which you just saw, social media campaign. And we focused primarily on using the descriptive and dynamic norms, which had the best results, and to inform the text we used, for example, in parts of the website and other products, and also scripting of the videos, so particularly the video you just saw, how the video interview questions were framed, and sort of the editing of those videos as well. And I say this is most clearly seen in the concept for the video you've just seen, which is the second promotional video, which is focusing on employers and their experiences. So if you go to the website, you'll see there's quite a few videos there, and there's a mix of people who were interviewed for those, including domestic workers, people from civil society, people from employment agencies, etc. So we ran 2 promotional campaigns. And each of those was for a 2-week period. One was at the launch of the website in October, November 2021. And also one just recently, end of May, June this year, with the new promotional video. And both campaigns targeted the same audience, those between roughly 25 to 55 years of age, with an interest in parenting and elderly care, and specifically in Hong Kong. The first campaign drove over 7,500 people to take the experience, and the second nearly 10,000. And both campaigns ran for roughly the same amount of time on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and with the first campaign having a slightly larger promotional budget, and the second campaign video and the social media posts we used, the results, we used the RCT results for that, and more fully than in the first campaign. And that may have influenced the increase in engagement. Obviously, we need to do a bit more digging around to see exactly what sort of made the engagement higher for the second campaign, even though the budget was lower. I'm going to share my screen now and just quickly go through the web experience, though I'd encourage everyone to have a look in your own time and take the challenge, so to speak. I apologize in advance for my rather 20th century internet connection, but I hope it gives you a good experience. Right, so hopefully you can see the landing page of the web experience here. And actually I'm gonna go back and stop my camera just to improve. I think you should. So,
and I think then, Robert, you need to share your screen.
No, I need to do that again. Do I? Okay, hold on. Okay, so Miriam, can you see the landing page for the website?
For the time being, no. I see you.
No. Oh, hold on a sec. Let me try that again. I'm going to put my video back on. So, hold on. Okay, how about now?
Still no. Still, I still see you. Do you want me to try to share on my screen?
Yeah, that's odd because it was working earlier.
Yeah, it's always like that, you know.
Let me try one more time, and then
yeah,
if it's
sure.
not working, we'll try that again. Okay. Why it's doing that? Oh, I see why. Hold on. There you go. How about
now
that?
It's fine. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, something was covering up the button for share.
No problem.
All right, so hopefully you can see this is the landing page of the web experience. And as I said, the users have the point of view of a prospective employer following a real world hiring pathway using the employment agency. And all of this is in, as was mentioned, is in Chinese and English. So there are two versions of the site and you can select those. And you will go through. I'm not sure how quickly this is load. I've got another one loaded just in case it's a little slow, but that will take you through. So let me just swap around. There you go. So when you enter the site, you see on the left-hand side that there are six chapters, and each of those reflects an exploitative or illegal behavior of agencies, but is also the sort of the process that you would go through, the sort of the pathway you would go through if you were engaging an agency. And so each time you're presented with three choices. So here you can see that it's, the text at the bottom, you and your partner are expecting a baby, etc. And so you want to hire a domestic worker, and you can sort of read a little bit more, and it gives you some choices. And so you decide which choice you think is best for you and will give you the best outcome. So for example, we might go, okay, let's ask a close friend who's hired a domestic worker, which agency they would sort of recommend. And so we do that. And that takes you through it. So each choice you make takes you through to a video. And each of the videos, I'm going to mute that. Each of the videos is specific to the choice you made and edited in a way to talk about sort of the choice you made and the consequences of those choices. And at the end of the video, you will get a, let me just pause that. At the end of each video, you will get some takeaways. So that provides the user with some brief insights into the problems and solutions related to that chapter. And hold on, it's getting a bit of sound coming through from the other tab. So yes, you get these takeaways, problems and solutions, and that ensures that for each issue, the user gets some sort of feedback, but also if they decide only to go through, say, 3 chapters, at least they have something to take away if they don't reach the end. And what you will see is that that there's a score. So each time you complete a chapter, you will get a score. So these are the takeaways you can see, and you can watch the video again, or you can go to the next chapter. So if you went to the next chapter, you will see the scoring is on the top right-hand side, and that you can follow to see how well you're doing. And then you keep going through these different chapters, yeah. And at the end, after 6 chapters, you will reach here, which is your final score. It's worth noting that if you do quite well, so you make some very good choices, you actually get to skip 2 of the chapters, and that's to reflect that good decisions also mean that you will have better outcomes, so you don't face some of the problems that you would face if you made worse choices. So here at the end, you get the score, and we did quite well. We got 11 out of 12, and it still gives you some feedback about how you can be sort of a good employer. So you can report bad practices from the agencies, particularly if they're overcharging or to confiscating passports, etc. And if you want to know more, you can go to view all recommendations. And this gives you a little bit more in-depth sort of insight into sort of what you can do. And it breaks it down into sort of pre-hiring, so before you hire someone, during the hiring process, and post-hiring. And if you go through the About page, then you will see that there's a lot of other materials there which also are related to this. So like the infographic, which Claire showed earlier, which we used in the RCT, some videos, etc. So anyone who's curious can sort of dive deeper, or you can just keep on the sort of gaming experience. So that's largely it. And so it was very interesting to see the engagement we got through the social media campaign. I think, as Claire was saying, what we'd like to be able to look into now is sort of how sort of people who have engaged with it, their behavior changes, what they do when they go to an agency now, whether they're adopting some of these strategies, etc. So that would be a next sort of stage to sort of look at what the results for people who engage in this tool are. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. And that's it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about the sort of the build, the sort of the storyline, etc. That we came up with there, the people we interviewed, etc.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the presentation. So many questions are now popping on the Q&As on the chat. So many questions for you, Robert. Also, questions for Gaëla and Claire. Let me maybe, if you don't mind, start a questions for you, Robert, as you just presented. How many scenarios you might have at the end, if you think about it, because you had, in fact, depending the answer you provided, then it's lead you to certain scenarios. How many scenarios you, if you remember, you have in the hiring challenge? Many, as I can imagine.
So that was a key question: is how big an experience should this be? Because you could build a hugely complex branching storyline experience for people where they could go off, for many hours. But of course, you have to mediate between the type of the sort of time and attention that people will give this sort of experience, but also what you want to communicate. So we knew the key issues. We started with, so what issues do we want people to be aware of and to take action on through the experience, and then how many choices do we give them? So we sort of worked out for each for each challenge, so each chapter, what are the sort of the choices that would distinguish, and how your outcome, the sort of the outcomes you have. So we have effectively 6 chapters, 3 different choices. There's 18 choices. But it does actually branch at one point where if you've scored above a certain threshold, you go a different way than everyone else who hasn't. So that adds a sort of another layer to it. So we thought that was quite a good balance between being able to communicate what we wanted and the time that people would engage with this type of experience.
Yeah, I think you say something very important is first, indeed, keeping the interest and keeping the attention of the person, but yet also being able to communicate a clear message and a message which is also full enough, to make sure that the person get the right information. So there is a kind of balance to ensure, which I assume is it can be very challenging. I have Gaëla, let me maybe ask you a question, because we also had questions very much also related to how do you think behavior inside experiences like the one you presented and we see today has also been happening on other initiatives within fair recruitment. Do you have some information on that, or is it something very unique that has been developed in the field of fair recruitment?
Thank you, Miriam. So in terms of the work that the ILO is doing on fair recruitment, I think this approach and the randomized control trial and the gaming experience is new, but it is one that we would like to try to replicate, perhaps adapt and use elsewhere. But at the same time, the ILO is also doing quite a lot of other types of innovations to promote fair recruitment. One of the key ones that started a few years ago already and was led by our key constituent, the International Trade Union Confederation, is an online platform that crowdsources reviews from migrant workers throughout their recruitment experience. It's called the Recruitment Advisor, and it's used widely across Southeast Asia, Middle East, and it's really about facilitating access to information to migrant workers through an online platform. And one of the other innovative layers that we worked with the ITUC last year to add was to make this platform and all of its information accessible through a chatbot. This was really to speak to research that we conducted on the behaviors on migrant workers actually around technology, and seeing that most people, people are on the move. They are using social media as their primary source of connection to the internet. So we thought that the chatbot modality would actually help then people to access all these layers of information that are online, but through the source that they most regularly use, which is, Facebook Messenger and other messenger apps. So that's another example of innovation used in for fair recruitment. And of course, we're hoping to be able to do more to ramp that up and to learn as we move along. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Gaila. And let me maybe, Claire, ask you, because, well, you have been working a lot on behavior insights and you have studied it. Do you know, outside of fair recruitment, but if the ILO is doing some work on maybe other sectors and some of the works, and this is in fact, if I may, coming to one of the questions we received from Adiyat Edwin-Taji, behavior insight is one of the imminent approach that more countries start to use for their public policy analysis. What can make UN bodies, and let's take ILO, start using this approach of analysis? What is expected by ILO of using behavior insights approach for other aspects or issue of labor and employment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the ILO is just at the beginning of researching, or exploring, I should say, how to apply behavioral insights to advancing towards decent work in general. As far as I know, the applications have really been limited to the field of domestic work, perhaps with only one or two small exceptions. And indeed, the way this started, and I think this might touch on some other questions that I've seen come up, is that we felt that with the field of domestic work in particular, it was very difficult to use the more traditional approaches of sort of labor inspections and the other labor market institutions that were not designed really to reach domestic workers. They were always more for enterprises, let's say. Everything from labor law to social security law, all of it has really been more designed to achieve some form of decent work for workers in enterprises. For domestic workers, it was always harder because the employer or the end user is the household. And when the agencies are involved, or when there's a service provider that might be employing the domestic worker, the situation gets significantly more complicated. And so we thought, what other strategies can we use to influence the behavior of employers? And the strength of the behavioral science approach is in the fact that it can either complement labor law and social security law and migration policy by encouraging compliance with the applicable laws, or it can be used also in contexts where there are no laws yet. And I think that's something that is really important, because so often we are limited in countries where there are no labor laws in place yet, or no social security, or whatever laws that we're looking towards. And so behavioral science offers a way in which to influence the behavior of employers, even if there is no law in place. It's always better and more effective when there is a law, of course, and we're just promoting compliance. But so at the ILO, we've been working on exploring how to promote compliance with labor and social security laws, and then here in Hong Kong to shift the market, let's say, the demand for fair and ethical recruitment services. I think that overall answers the question.
Thank you, Claire. And if I may, and I will maybe ask the question, if you don't mind, in French, because it's in the chat in French. Toujours lié en fait par rapport aux outils.
So always linked to the instruments of behavioral insights. In the sector of domestic work, in your opinion, what could be these behavioral insights and tools to be taken into account? It's a question coming from Mr. Oloni. I don't know whether you can add something about this point or whether you have examples, concrete examples to provide us with. Yes, in fact, the easy answer would be yes. There are many instruments, and we are just at the beginning of this research. We've been trying to identify the different methods and approaches to change the behavior of employers vis-à-vis domestic workers. But, for example, in terms of social security, we see that domestic workers often are not willing to contribute to social security because they prefer keeping their money. So this represents something very typical that in behavioral science is considered as a bias, because the future is so uncertain that why setting money on aside for a future that is so unsure? And so this is something that is applied to the vast majority in the world of informal economy. And if we can learn this type of knowledge coming from behavioral science, we can certainly improve the laws in order to take into account this type of perception, to tackle this kind of perception in domestic workers. As of employers, often I think it comes very often. We have a big problem with most employers, especially when there are no laws and there is no communication from the government concerning their obligations and responsibilities in legal terms. So when there is a lack of communication and knowledge in this sense, employers turn to their families, turn to their neighbors, and they ask, how much do you pay your domestic work? They ask them, how do you choose a recruiter? And that's how it works. That's how we see the development of a social norm that normally is very negative. And that is why it is very important to have a combined approach where we have a law that is very clear in terms of obligations. So we need laws establishing decent work measures. And it's important to start changing these behavior in line with the law. So I hope this answers the question, but I said we are at the very beginning, and so there are so many applications of behavioral science that could be very, very useful in order to improve the situation of domestic workers. Thank you very much, Claire, for your answer. And in fact, our participant had asked a complementary question, and you have really touched upon the points that were raised. So in fact, you really provided a good example, which is the one concerning social protection related to domestic work. But that's the point raised by the participants that also touches upon points that could be replicated in many informal sectors. So in fact, this question comes back, the question of investing in social protection. So thank you very much for your question.
Many questions for you in the Q&A. So maybe let me start with a very interesting questions from our participants, Elisa, who asking why, and indeed, why did you decide to take the hiring change as a role play? And clearly also you highlighted, you focused on parenting and elderly. So why did you took this choice rather than having it based on employers' actual needs and experience? So Any answer to that questions?
Yes, so there's really two parts to that answer. One is that our understanding of the general needs of employers of domestic workers in Hong Kong, and that because of that sort of knowledge, we know that the majority will go through this type of process and will face these type of challenges. So what we're trying to do is to connect with the majority of employers there. And so that's why we picked the issues that we did. For the role play, it's really to engage people. So we could just present, and people have done for many years now, just present the information and the where they could go through to get to the answers. But we felt that this was actually a better way to engage people, rather than just say, oh, you can go here to find an answer to this. We wanted them to actually engage with this experience, because the research shows that people are more likely then to digest that information, that experience, and then hopefully then go and use it. I think it's worth pointing out that at the beginning I said this was a centerpiece of the project, and we haven't really talked about how you then utilize this and some of the other products. So of course, people can go online and take part in the experience and then take away from that what they will. But we also have all the videos that are featured in the experience, plus the one you saw today, were all put out through social media as well. So people are engaging through it there. So that's partly to drive people to the experience, but in themselves, they contain quite useful information. But also, what we want to use the experience for is a tool to engage with people in a much more qualitative way. And so we have an outreach campaign where we're talking to businesses, to educational institutions and civil society organizations. So where we would go there and present to an audience. So for example, with one law firm, they've invited us to do a presentation to one of their family groups. And so that's their employees who might hire a domestic worker. Similarly, we might go to a faith-based organization and use the tool, the experience, to present to them and have a discussion and learn, also get some feedback from them. So it's not just sitting there on the web and people go to it. We screen the videos for people. We can go and actually present to them and use it in an interactive way as part of that presentation.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that. Can I have because there is a kind of follow-up question, and it's very much related to what we say at the beginning, when right after you presented the video on, the balance between the information you need to provide that has to be complete and the time people are connected and you don't want to lose their attentions. So Elisa has a kind of follow-up question where she said, how many of the employers got to the end? She said she tried her son and she found it very good, but a bit long. So she wondered if maybe you have already, some statistic on that. Do you know if some measure has been taken also already to make sure that you are not losing the attention of some of the employers?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and one we asked ourselves in designing the site and the videos that go on the site. So how long an experience will people engage with? And these type of products tend to you demand more of the time of people than maybe just looking at a post on Twitter, for example. But what we see is actually, of course, you get some drop off, and that's inevitable for any website, because people sometimes go to the wrong place. And so you get that drop off, and then some people, maybe because they don't have time. But generally, we find the engagement is quite good. And it's interesting to see. So that latest video you saw is fairly long. There's a 5-minute version, a 6-minute version. But we found that engagement with that on social media it held up against the shorter videos, which you see on the website, which range between about 1 and 2 minutes. So there's always this balance about how long something is and how much you want to communicate and whether that engagement will be. I think one of the things I always say to people, because there's this, I think there's a sort of a misconception about engagement online, is that people think there's a sort of a set time frame roughly where people will engage in a piece of video. But you've got to remember, of course, that we watch little 30-second clips, but we also watch 3-hour movies. And so it's really the context of what you're watching that determines your attention span. And so there isn't a sort of an easy answer for how long something is. So we look at the metrics for this constantly. And as I say, the engagement is slightly counterintuitive, that the longer video actually keeps people engaged just as much as a shorter video. And we do find people do go through the experience, but say you do get some drop off. But again, there's that part of the experience is the online one, but also the utilization of it in a sort of more face-to-face presentational way as well. So there's sort of a lot of metrics to really sort of crunch there, and to make sort of some sort of evaluation based on all of that rather than just one aspect of the site.
Thank you very much, Robert. We still have, I'm looking at the time, we have more or less 15 minutes, still a lot of questions. So let me maybe come back to you later on, Robert, because there are still some questions for you. But Gaëla, I want to ask you maybe the questions we have in the chat from our participants, Rebecca, regarding good recruiters, Did you feel confident enough that there were actually good recruiters that employers would find if they click on the government website? Because she said she has a lot of problem in the vein of Southeast Asia. And so actually, indeed, it's a very good question, because it means that we also rely on the list provided by the government. So how did you feel, Gaëla? If this was a question you asked yourself when you started maybe the whole process?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for that really interesting question. It is a question we asked ourselves. And we also discussed, as Rob also mentioned, we had a design thinking workshop at the very onset of designing this pilot. And we were brainstorming with a whole range of stakeholders in Hong Kong about, how do you actually find the information? What are reliable sources of information? And what we found is that you actually need a combination of various sources. One thing is that potential employers themselves don't necessarily check the government sources. The fact that there is a list of registered agencies is not known to all. So one thing is that we also wanted to promote access to that information. But one of the key things we developed also for the hiring challenge is something Rob showed at the end, which is a list of tips for employers, of questions to ask to agencies when they are meeting with agencies. What questions should they be asking them and why? Questions to ask afterwards to the domestic worker that they have employed through this agency as a follow-up and a verification of the stories that the agencies will tell, and the story, cross-checking with the story of the migrant worker. So it's really about combining these sorts of information. This is where we really wanted to, what we wanted to highlight, but also to give some, a set of very finite questions around that to employers. So there are several resources that we link through the website. And many partners in Hong Kong also have some excellent resources along those lines. So the dissemination plan that we have really involves also talking with a lot of the organizations that are reaching out to employers, so that we come together with the same sort of same sources of information, same content, with the same messages.
Thank you very much, Gaëla. A question maybe for you, Claire, now, because we didn't necessarily, for the time being, highlighted the questions related to protecting migrant domestic workers in an irregular situation. And I wanted to know if, how this work can also address in a way the lack of the lack of protection that are maybe faced by some domestic workers who don't have maybe who are undocumented. How do you bring also fair recruitment practice to this kind of migrant workers? So any thought on that? Maybe Claire and also of course Gaëla, if you want to jump in after Claire answer.
Yes, it speaks a little bit to what I was trying to convey earlier, that I think behavioral science is an interesting tool because of its flexibility in using whether or not there is a legal framework in place. There is a whole lot more that we can do when the law is in place. And I think that, advocating for labor and social security protection and migration policies that promote fair recruitment are absolutely essential. And then the way behavioral science can be used in that vein is, first of all, in the design of those laws and policies, so that at the outset, when they're designed, they are already taking into account the behavioral tendencies of both employers and domestic workers and the agencies that are involved in the recruitment process. So there's obviously no easy answer to this. The undocumented, domestic workers in an irregular status are by far the most vulnerable, being that they are separated from their communities and really left in isolation in ways that national domestic workers are not. So I don't think that we can say that there's a simple solution to this. But again, I think that there's a lot to be said for thinking about doing more, let's say, research at the grassroots level among both undocumented domestic workers and the employers who tend to hire them, and an analysis of the legal framework to understand why these forms exist and what entry points there might be to start shifting the preferences of the employers, who have quite an influence in the end over what this market will look like. So I am afraid that's where I'll leave it. Gaëla, maybe you have more to add.
Thanks, Claire. No, I think this is good. What I actually wanted to respond to is also another question I saw on how the project intends to evaluate the approach, and we've been having that conversation with Rob and Claire just recently. So there are two approaches, complementary approaches to that. The first will be, in fact, just to look at the data on the website, examine also, the use of different parts of the hiring challenge, including how many people actually get to the end, speaking to one of the early questions. So try to understand a little bit people's behavior on the website through the data. But also we would like at the right time to run a survey, another quantitative survey, I think possibly with a market research partner that was involved in the RCT, and try to construct an impact evaluation survey. So we'll start working on that in the next few months. But it really is key, because it's understanding the investment that was made in that research, understanding the assumptions we have also about the randomized control trial actually have made a difference in how people consult the information, and then seeing, it's also very important for us to validate this approach, to learn from it before we decide to ramp up and to replicate in other contexts.
Thank you very much, Gaëla. Indeed, the questions on the how you think about evaluating this initiative, and thanks for answering to that, Gaëla. And in fact, to maybe on the same page, maybe for you, Robert, because there is a lot of information in the Hiring Challenge website. about also updating it, how do you think this would work? Because I assume it might also require some updating. Did you also thought and discuss about that when you developed it? And what is, you think, your strategy regarding that aspect?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So obviously when we started, we had some context and understanding how fluid this sort of the situation is in regards to that sort of migration pathway and the government's sort of mechanisms for that and how the agencies operate. So we sort of know roughly how things in the past had progressed, but not necessarily, how that will work in the future. We thought that the experience would have roughly a 3-year lifespan, and of course there may be changes which make some of the information out of date. That could happen. Largely, though, there's a lot going on there which probably won't change, and so you would have to sort of, if there was a major change by the government in regards to, for example, the way it legislated for the agencies, then you would have to go back and look at, should we be changing some of this information or not? So we actually involved in another piece of another project, was research on the Code of Practice for Employment Agencies, which is the government's non-binding response to the exploitation and trafficking for forced labor of domestic workers into Hong Kong. And it's sort of based on it's 5 years of that code of practice being in place, and what the outcome of that is that actually very little has changed. Now, of course, you would hope that the government is going to respond to that by bringing in some changes, which would then have an impact on sort of this type of product, because you might actually have to change some things. For example, in regards to, say they changed how the confiscation of passports was legislated against. So that might require us to do an edit on sort of a video or something like that, or so the guide might, you edit. So depending on the change would depend on what sort of needs amending. And then you'd have to evaluate whether that's something which we would want to do, and if so, how to do it.
Thank you very much, Robert. Still, if I may, I still have a question for you, and that's coming from our participants, Grace, who is joining from Taiwan. And she has actually 2 questions. The first one is there, according to you, a public agency instead of private agency as a choice for employers and migrant workers? And as you refer employers to consult, report the bad habits to employment agency portal, may I ask how the Bureau work? Are they taking effective actions to protect both workers and employers' rights? So do you have some answer to that? And I don't know, of course, Claire, Gaëla, if you want maybe also to tap on, maybe Robert first, and then Gaëla, if you want to add something.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question about a public agency, I assume that what that is referring to is whether there's a government a mechanism for the recruitment of domestic workers which employers could go to, and there isn't. All of them are privately run, so that's that. And for the second question, in regards to, I assume that's about complaints mechanisms, yeah. So if if there is bad practice, so a domestic worker or an employer go to. So there is the portal that was mentioned earlier, which was where the RCT sent people, and there's online mechanisms. But one of the problems that domestic workers, state again and again is that for them to make a complaint, usually they will go to the Labour Department and make that complaint. But the Labour Department is closed on a Sunday when the majority of domestic workers actually have the day off. And so that's really problematic. And I was talking to the Federation of Asian Domestic Workers Unions just last week about this. They have a meeting with the Labour Department very soon. And it's one of the things they want to push is why there aren't mechanisms that facilitate them making complaints. Because if you look at the statistics for complaints in Hong Kong, you'll see that they're exceedingly low, given the research, what the research tells us about the number of breaches of the law. And the number of agencies that are actually prosecuted is pitifully low. And the Labour Department tends to take that as, well, there's not a problem. Whereas actually we look at it and say, you haven't got effective ways of people making complaints. So that's an issue. There are mechanisms to do that online, in person, but they tend not to be the best way of encouraging people to come in and report the illegal practices of agencies.
Thank you very much. Gaëla, I saw that you also wanted to answer to some questions from our participants. Nestor, if it's about that, can I just ask you to wait for a moment? Do you wanted to add something to what Robert just said?
Yeah, maybe just, I mean, a couple of points. One is that the Labour Department in Hong Kong had started to post online the lists of agencies that had either certificates removed or that had had some sanctions, which was already a step. I mean, as Rob said, you know, compared to the number of agencies in Hong Kong, it's a little bit tip of the iceberg, but it's already a step in that direction of transparency, and you know, we really did welcome that that move. And in terms of access to justice and complaints mechanisms for workers, this is also part of what many partners on the ILO has been promoting and trying to facilitate to migrant workers in Hong Kong through having access to the information about the procedures, also through the consulates and then through the trade unions that are doing amazing work with facilitating different cases and access to legal resources and other complaints mechanisms. So there's so much happening in that regard behind the scenes to accompany workers through whatever problems may arise. So some of this work is also documented in through the ILO and the partner websites. But I think important to say that the very active role that civil society has been taking in that regard to also move in that space where there is really still a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much, Gaëla. We have, I would say, two questions which actually are quite a kind of nice bridge to, I would say, the last part, because we are coming to close to an end of our webinar. And we have two questions which actually are quite a good bridge to the last part. That is actually questions for the audience. But let me still maybe raise the questions. Maybe first for you, Claire, very interesting questions from Moza in terms of behavioral insights. Are all countries actually practicing it in terms of tackling the issue of employment and labor? So, in other words, have you seen that many countries now are using it, and or maybe also some trends? Have you seen maybe that is maybe used in more certain region rather than others, or any comments on that, Claire?
Yes, it's definitely becoming a more and more popular approach. I can't say the exact number of countries, but let's say first, beyond the world of work, beyond employment and labor, I think there are a very significant number of countries that have developed behavioral insights teams. And often there's sort of public-private partnerships that are developed between a behavioral insights consultancy that's working together with the government to establish a unit in the beginning to sort of establish some capacity. In terms of labor and employment, there are fewer, but there are a couple of initiatives that show that it's starting to be taken up more. So one is that there's the labor working group of the G20 that has a behavioral insights team, and they've started to do a mapping of the countries that have behavioral insights teams embedded in either their ministries of labor or employment or similar. And I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but there were several, let's say, that had behavioral insights teams that were working on labor and employment. There also is more and more, let's say there's some areas that have more behavioral insights already than others. So for example, discrimination in hiring, there's a lot of behavioral science that's been applied to try to reduce discriminatory hiring practices. There's quite a bit on gender equality. And then also about employment and how to get people who have been unemployed for a long time to seek employment and to get employment. So it's really working on issues of motivation. In the informal economy, though, which is obviously much more widespread across the world, there's been much less, quite a bit on social welfare schemes, the uptake of social programs that relates somewhat to employment and informality. But that's really the area in which we're trying to draw some lessons so that we can apply it more and more to workers in the informal economy or economic units in the informal economy. And I might take the opportunity for the sake of time to also say that the work that Ayaka mentioned in her presentation represents also the most recent efforts of the UN entities in applying behavioral science. There has been more and more efforts towards this end, and the ILO is contributing to that. So it is an approach that you will see more and more frequently, let's say, across UN agencies. And if you are interested in being more involved or becoming more informed of what's happening in the world of behavioral science at the United Nations, I can also share some links to that end.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, please do so maybe in the chat if you have one or two links you might want to share with participants. So I think that would be much than appreciated. And well, to what extent it's replicable, I would say, in different contexts or in countries. But Gaëla, to what extent do you think other sectors? I think Claire already started to answer. She mentioned it, but to what extent do you think indeed it can go beyond domestic work?
Peut-être je peux répondre à cette question en français comme elle a été posée en
I would like to answer to this question in French as it was asked in French. So thank you very much for this question, Mr. Aloni. It's true that one of the reasons why we started this approach was really because the sector of domestic employment is quite special, since the workers find themselves in a very hidden situation. In Hong Kong, the law obliges to accommodate also domestic workers at the employer's home. And so there is no effect of, as it happens in a company, where there is a group of workers who get organized to get and deliver information. And so this union approach is lost in these contexts, in the context of domestic work. Hence, the importance of engaging workers in a tight way to the unions in place and to promoting their membership to these unions. This is to explain why the peculiarity of domestic work. Clearly, I would be interested in studying the possibility of employing these techniques also to other sectors, especially the informal one with vulnerable populations, and also seasonal work. So, and let's say more formal work. So we have it for the hotel sector, agricultural sector, all these sectors are concerned. And for us, it is really a beginning. And so we're going to work for the future and within the scope of the FAIR program that is going to extend itself, focusing now on the African region. So as to find sectors where we can steer this approach, always with a pilot approach. We are trying many things so as to get lessons, but also we will appreciate your suggestions and your ideas. And I believe that engaging in a network, an innovation network, to have these conversations online, and also using the knowledge sharing within the scope of the initiative for fair recruitment, having a segment on innovation, we will have more exchanges and ideas and proposals by our partners on the sectors where we can extend this approach. Thank you very much, Gaëla. And let me continue in French. As you mentioned, it is just the beginning of these initiatives, of the ILO initiatives, but also the beginning of dialogue with our members, with our constituents, and with the participants. And so that's why we have prepared two questions that we would like to ask to the participants today joining this webinar. And let me ask you to use Slido and share my screen. So you should be able to see on my screen a blue page, slido.com. So the question is very easy. By scanning the QR code that you see appearing on the screen, or joining the link. You can use your mobile or computer. You just click on slido.com, hashtag DWDW, Decent Work for Domestic Workers. You can answer these questions. It will be asked, first of all, how do you see the behavioral experiment replicable to other sectors? So this expertise, is it easily replicable in other sectors? Probably in only certain sectors. So the first one, or maybe it's not reproducible in other sectors, not replicable. Let's see your answers. We're waiting for a while. So if you have a problem in joining using Slido, in the chat, you should be able to write down your comments. And let me also put the link in the chat box and answer from your computer.
Alors on voit pour l'instant une majorité de.
So for now we see that a majority of our participants say that yes, very likely replicable in all sectors. So it's encouraging. But I see only 7% say that no, I don't think it is replicable. And also it's 6%. So the vast majority, 63%, thinks that it's very likely replicable in all sectors. And second question, you have largely discussed of the instrument, so also the immersive gaming campaign. So how innovative did you find the immersive gaming campaign to trigger behavior change? Yes, very innovative. It would be interesting. I would be interested to duplicate it in my country. Somehow innovative, but I don't think necessarily it is the most positive tool in my own context. Or the last answer, I don't think it is particularly innovative. So we see now 73% of people that found it particularly innovative. And I see it's particularly replicable. So some are answering also via chat. So very innovative. So clearly a vast majority. So finally, if we sum up these two questions, this is particularly positive. So it's replicable, yes, to all sectors, in all contexts. So we see it also with the participants posting on this session, question Q&A session. Many are saying it is innovative, very innovative. So I will stop sharing my screen. Claire, Gaëla, it's encouraging for the future. So I think that clearly we can encourage participants. Melanie has posted the link to have access to the platform online that will enable us in the future to go on and to have more information and continue with the dialogue and enable participants to keep on receiving news about the initiatives. So very last question to conclude for the three of you. So what kind of future are we expecting? How do you see this instrument in 1 or 2 years? And would you like to see it in other contexts, in other sectors, in other languages? What is the future? What does the future hold? That's my last question for the three of you. So Robert, if you want to answer, Claire and Gaëla.
Let me take the occasion to thank you. Impressive contribution. It was a pleasure to facilitate it, and thank you very much for that. And thanks also the participants. Robert, give you the floor.
Thanks, Miriam. I think for me and for our company, understanding the audience that you're speaking to is of primary importance when you're developing communication strategies and tools. And so we're always trying to do that. And it's a lot of it's having a matter of data. And so the type of research that was done for this project is fantastic. It allows us to really craft and target our response and hopefully increase that engagement and the outcomes from that engagement. So I think being able to use this for the type of work that we do with civil society organizations, trade unions, etc., is great. And for me, this was sort of a first experience of this before we used more anecdotal data and understandings that we built up over time and other types of research that wasn't directly engaging with that audience. So for me, it's fantastic. And the application, you can build quite a sophisticated project like this, but you can use it in just text. You put in a tweet, and hopefully that increases your engagement. So I think that the application, once you have this type of data, is great. So it's really encouraging to do this type of research, because otherwise I think we're sort of a little bit shooting in the dark.
Peut-être Claire, à toi, si tu veux peut-être.
Maybe Claire, if you want to add a couple of words, conclusive words concerning the tool, and then Gaëla.
Absolutely. So I think that this was a really excellent example and opportunity to apply behavioral science. There are some conditions, behavioral science is not always the best tool to use. But in this case, I think we found a very good use for it to better understand what would motivate employers to select a given agency or not. Most often, behavioral science research of this kind has to be combined with more structural changes, as I've said before, about the law and policy frameworks. And I think in this case, it was a good example of how we were able to use the existing framework, which could still be improved, but there was a framework there where we could also explore behavioral science approaches and methodologies. It's also an environment where we were able to conduct an experiment with statistically significant results. And often that can be difficult to do. So it's something to take into consideration each time that we're looking to use behavioral science as an approach. Are there conditions in place to actually carry this out? Can we actually get a sample size and design an experiment that will give us results that are statistically significant, that really show what factors are causing what behaviors? And that's something that we were able to do here. So going forward, we will certainly be building off of this work on domestic work in other countries. I think that the ILO's program on domestic work is one that will still be using behavioral science as much as possible towards other decent work outcomes as well. Social Security is the one in which I think we will be doing the most work in the foreseeable future, but I'm also very hopeful to use it more towards fair recruitment as well. In general, like I said, the United Nations is continuing to develop its work on behavioral science, and I've been working with the UN Behavioral Science Group and also with the Executive Office of the Secretary General to see how we can continue to build our collective capacity to implement behavioral science across the board. And I think that it's really important to say that so much behavioral science right now has been taking place in more developed contexts. And what we're really trying to do is figure out how to bring behavioral science into countries that are less developed economically, in contexts where there are fewer structures in place to support the implementation of behavioral science, and figure out ways of adapting the methodologies and developing insights that are really based on the local context and not just behavioral insights that were developed in other countries and then applied to other contexts. In fact, that's the mantra for behavioral science, is that context is everything. So the analysis, the research the diagnostic has to be conducted on location with the target population, so that the solutions that are developed are adapted to that population and that context. So I'm very hopeful that we will continue to have the opportunity to do that kind of research in more countries across the world in the future.
Thanks very much, Claire, and Rob for those words. So perhaps just to close the event, I mean, first, I think this experience, these pilots have also showed the extent of the collaboration that is involved. It's very satisfying and interesting to have worked with the experts in behavioral sciences, building this, understanding the process of the research, which then feeds into the communications and then feeds into the tools that we use. So that, I think, bringing in on board all these levels of expertise and the quality of the products, communication products also that was developed by Rob's team is very satisfying. We were lucky and fortunate to have the resources to do so with the FAIR project, with the support of the Swiss Development Corporation. And I think moving forward, we definitely want to learn on that. We'd like to replicate as much as possible, but also to use, as Rob mentioned, also to use this in more, in perhaps less complex way to be able to tap into insights of behavioral research, to try to shift little changes without necessarily building, a gaming platform around it. So to make it more of a way of working for us. And I think it's particularly lends itself to the complex work around recruitment, because so many actors are involved, and generating fair recruitment actually means a change in behavior on all parts, on the worker sides, on the employer sides, on the recruiter sides, on the government side, on the inspectorate. So on that level and in that process of recruitment, there's really a lot of opportunity. I mean, I would see, hopefully a future where you can use more easily behavioral feedback from behavioral tests, where it's maybe even possible to automate the analysis that's done through a survey. And maybe this is something that would happen ultimately, but certainly I would find it difficult to move forward now without having this insight ahead of us and understanding some of the assumptions. I mean, one of the assumptions we had made, in fact, during the design thinking workshop in Hong Kong was that the element of an agency being professional was maybe what would motivate people more. And then we saw with the randomized control trial that it was, there was another social norm involved. So testing all our assumptions is really such an important strength of the behavioral insights. So on that note, I really wanted to thank all the contributors for your excellent presentations, and also the participants for the questions, which were really inspiring, and I think made for a very, very engaging dialogue in the second part of the webinar. So thank you so much for all the contribution. And thank you, Miriam, for your facilitation, and to all the team that has created the event. Thank you very much.